I found out my husband's girlfriend was replacing me at work the same moment. My boss smiled and said my name like it already belonged to the past. "Elena, we've decided to move in a different direction," he said, fingers laced calmly on the conference table. And then he turned his hand toward her, like he was presenting something new and polished. "This is Sophia. She'll be taking over your role starting today." And for a second, I thought I misheard him because Sophia had been standing barefoot in my kitchen 3 nights ago, holding a glass of wine I bought, while laughing at something my husband whispered in her ear. "She has incredible energy," my boss added, and someone across the table cleared their throat, but no one spoke. Not even my husband, who sat at the far end avoiding my eyes like eye contact, would make this real. Like silence could excuse betrayal. I felt every gaze in that room shift away from me, screens lighting up, pens tapping, anything but looking at the woman being quietly erased. "You trained her?" someone finally asked, too casually, like they were asking about the weather, and my boss gave a small nod. "Elena has been transitioning her responsibilities. Transitioning, like I'd agreed to disappear, like I'd handed over 8 years of my life with a smile." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and stood slowly, my chair scraping softly against the floor. "Congratulations," I said, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. I walked toward her and extended my hand. Sophia hesitated just a fraction of a second before taking it, her grip light, uncertain, like she knew something didn't add up but didn't care enough to ask. "Thank you," she said, too bright, too practiced, and I noticed the way her eyes flickered past me toward my husband, just for reassurance, just for confirmation. He didn't look up, not once, and that silence said more than anything he could have said out loud. I smiled again, small, controlled, and let go of her hand. Then I turned and walked out of that room without looking back. The hallway felt longer than usual, the fluorescent lights too sharp, every step echoing just a little louder than it should have. I passed my desk where my coffee mug still sat half full, the screen still open to a dashboard only I fully understood, and I didn't touch anything. Not yet, because something inside me had gone very still. Not broken, just still. Like the moment before a storm decides where it's going to land. Before we go any further, if this story speaks to your heart, only if this story truly resonates with you, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. I always read them, and it reminds me that I wasn't as alone as I felt that morning. My name is Elena Rivera. I'm 34 years old, and that was the day my husband, my boss, and an entire room full of people decided I was replaceable. The day everything in my marriage and my career collapsed into a single quiet moment. But to understand why I didn't argue, why I didn't cry, why I just smiled and walked out, you have to go back to where this really started. Because this wasn't the first time I was made to feel small. It was just the first time I realized how much I'd been hiding. 8 years earlier, I walked into that company with a laptop that barely worked, and a promise that I would fix a system no one else wanted to touch. "It's a mess," my boss had told me back then, dropping a stack of reports on my desk. "We just need it to function." And I remember nodding, opening files that looked like they'd been built by 10 different people who never spoke to each other, broken processes layered over each other, patches on top of patches. And I stayed late that first night, then the next, because every problem I solved uncovered 3 more. And slowly, quietly, I became the person everything depended on, the one who knew where every piece connected, the one people came to when something broke at 2 a.m. The one who fixed things before anyone even noticed they were broken. "You're a lifesaver," coworkers would say, laughing, relieved, and I would smile, say it was nothing. Because it was easier that way, easier not to explain how much of myself I was pouring into something no one really saw. And at home, it was the same pattern. My husband would come in, loosen his tie, drop his keys on the counter. "Long day?" he'd ask without looking up from his phone. And I'd say, "Yeah, just busy." Because explaining the truth felt unnecessary, like it wouldn't land anyway, like it never really did. Over time, the late nights became normal, the missed dinners, the quiet apologies. "You work too much?" he'd say sometimes, not angry, just distant, like it was an observation about the weather, not something we were supposed to fix. And then one night, about 6 months ago, I came home earlier than usual, around 7:30 p.m. the sun still catching the edges of the buildings outside, and I remember hearing laughter before I even opened the door. A woman's voice, light, unfamiliar, and his voice, softer than I'd heard it in a long time. I stepped inside and saw her standing in my kitchen, barefoot on the hardwood floor, holding one of my wine glasses. "Oh," she said when she saw me, like I was the one who didn't belong there. "You're home early," my husband added too quickly, and I stood there with my keys still in my hand, looking at both of them, waiting for something. An explanation, a correction, anything. "This is Sophia," he said finally, like that was enough, like a name could fill in all the missing pieces. And she smiled at me, polite, confident, like she'd already been introduced to my life long before I knew she existed. I set my bag down slowly, every movement deliberate, controlled. "Nice to meet you," I said, because at that point I didn't know what else to say, and she nodded, taking a small sip from my glass, like she was comfortable, like she planned to stay. And the strangest part wasn't the shock. It wasn't even the anger. It was the quiet realization settling in that something had been shifting for a long time, and I had chosen not to see it, not to ask the questions I should have asked, because I was too busy holding everything else together. And as I stood there in my own kitchen watching them pretend this was normal, I remember thinking there was something I was missing, something just beneath the surface that didn't make sense yet, and I didn't know then how deep it went. I didn't know that the truth about Sophia, about my husband, about that job I thought I understood, was already sitting right in front of me, hidden in plain sight, waiting for me to finally connect the dots, and by the time I did, it was almost too late. When I think back to where I first learned how to stay quiet, it was not in that conference room, and it was not in my marriage. It was in a small 2-bedroom house where everything had a place except me. My mother used to say, "Do not make things harder than they need to be, Elena," while folding laundry at the kitchen table, her hands moving fast like if she slowed down, everything would fall apart, and I would stand there holding my report card waiting for her to look up. "I got all A's," I said once, my voice careful, hopeful, and she nodded without lifting her eyes. "That is what you are supposed to do," she replied, like it was expected, like it did not deserve anything more. My younger cousin Mateo, who lived with us after his parents moved away for work, would come running in right after with a crumpled sheet full of B's and C's. "Look what I got," he said, and my mother would smile, real and warm. "That is good, you are improving," she would tell him, reaching out to ruffle his hair. And I remember standing there still holding my paper, feeling something small and quiet settle inside my chest. Not anger, not yet, just the understanding that effort only mattered when it came from someone else. Not me. Dinners were the same. I learned early how to read the room, how to pass the salt before anyone asked, how to refill glasses without interrupting a conversation. "You are so helpful," my aunt would say whenever she visited, watching me move around the table, and my mother would nod. "She knows her place," she said once. Not cruel, just factual, like she was describing the weather, and I smiled because that was what I had learned to do, to keep things smooth, to keep things easy, to make myself useful in ways that did not require attention. One night, when I was about 12, the power went out during a storm, the house went completely dark, and Mateo started complaining immediately. "This is boring. I cannot even see," he said, kicking the side of the couch, and my mother sighed. "Elena, go get the candles," she called from the kitchen. I moved through the dark hallway by memory, fingers brushing along the wall until I reached the cabinet where we kept them. I lit 3 candles and set them on the table, the soft light flickering across everyone's faces. "See, she always knows what to do," my aunt said, impressed. And my mother gave a small approving nod, and for a second I felt proud, not because anyone really saw me, but because I had solved the problem before it became one. That feeling stayed with me, that quiet satisfaction of fixing things before they broke, of holding everything together without asking for anything back. Years later, when I got my first job in tech, it felt familiar in a way I could not explain. Systems that did not quite work, processes that no one wanted to untangle. I stepped into it the same way I stepped into that dark hallway, by instinct, by habit. "You are the only one who understands this," my manager told me during my first year, pointing at lines of code that made no sense to anyone else, and I nodded, not correcting him, not telling him that I understood it because I had built most of it from scratch, because explaining felt unnecessary. At home, things followed a similar pattern. When I met my husband, he used to notice me in small ways. "You always think 3 steps ahead," he said once, smiling, impressed. And I remember feeling seen in a way that felt new, like maybe this time it would be different, like maybe I would not have to shrink to keep the peace. But over time, that attention shifted, slowly enough that I did not recognize it at first. "You do not have to handle everything," he would say, but then he would let me handle everything anyway. Bills, schedules, repairs, conversations that needed to happen but did not, and I did it without complaint because it felt natural, because it felt like what I was supposed to do. And then came the subtle changes, the way he started checking his phone more often during dinner, the way he would pause before answering simple questions. "Who were you texting?" I asked one evening, keeping my tone light, casual, and he shrugged without looking up. "Just work," he said too quickly, and I let it go, because pushing felt like making things harder, because I had spent my whole life learning how not to do that. A few weeks later, I noticed a name pop up on his screen while he was in the shower. Sophia, just a message preview. Nothing explicit, just, "See you tomorrow," and I stood there for a moment holding his phone, staring at those 3 words, feeling that same quiet feeling from years ago settle in my chest. Something was off, something was not being said, and I could either ask or I could stay silent, and I chose silence because that was what I had always done, because that was how I kept things from falling apart. But standing there in that dim bathroom light, the sound of the shower running behind the door, I realized something that I had not wanted to admit before. This time staying quiet was not keeping anything together. It was just giving something else space to grow, and I did not know yet how far it had already gone. I only knew that whatever I had been ignoring was about to become impossible to ignore, and I was not sure I was ready for what that would mean. I did not confront him that night, and I did not ask about the message the next morning either. Instead, I went to work earlier than usual and sat at my desk with a cup of coffee that went cold before I took a second sip because something else had already taken over my attention. An email marked urgent from one of our largest clients, subject line reading system instability, and I felt that familiar shift inside me. The part of me that knew how to fix things before anyone else even understood they were broken. I opened the logs and immediately saw the issue. A conflict in the integration layer that had been quietly building for weeks, maybe longer, something only someone who understood the structure underneath would recognize. "Of course," I whispered under my breath, fingers already moving across the keyboard, and within minutes I was tracing the problem back to a piece of code I had written 3 years ago. Something small, something no one else would have noticed. I adjusted it, tested it, pushed the fix, and watched the system stabilize in real time. A small, clean solution to what could have turned into a major failure. "Elena, did you see this?" My manager called from across the room, his voice tight with concern, and I nodded without looking up. "It is handled," I said, calm, controlled, and he walked over, peering at my screen. "Already?" he asked, surprised, and I gave a small shrug. "It was not complicated," I replied, even though we both knew that was not entirely true. By noon, the client had sent a thank you email, praising the quick resolution, copying upper management, mentioning my name directly, and I saw it land in my inbox along with a few others. Small acknowledgments that usually passed quietly, but this time felt different, heavier somehow, like they were adding up to something. "You saved us today," my manager said later, leaning against the edge of my desk, his tone half joking, but not really. Again, I added softly, more to myself than to him. He smiled. But there was something else behind it, something thoughtful, like he was seeing a pattern he had not fully considered before. That afternoon, I was called into a meeting with senior leadership, not unusual, but the tone felt different, more focused, more direct. "We have been reviewing performance across departments," one of the directors said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. "And your contributions have been significant." I opened it and saw reports I recognized. Metrics tied directly to systems I had built, improvements that had been attributed to the team but traced back to my work, quietly, consistently, over years. "We are considering restructuring," he continued, "and potentially expanding your role." I felt a small pause inside me, not excitement exactly, more like recognition, like something I had always known was finally being said out loud. "What would that look like?" I asked, keeping my voice even, and he exchanged a glance with the others before answering, Leadership over operations systems, full oversight. And I nodded slowly, processing. That is a big shift, I said, and he leaned forward slightly. You are already doing it, Elena. We just have not formalized it. I left that meeting with a folder in my hands and a quiet sense that something had just changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to shift the balance of things in ways that would matter later. At home that night, I mentioned it casually while setting the table. They might be expanding my role, I said, placing a plate in front of him, and he looked up briefly from his phone. That is good, he replied, distracted, then went back to scrolling. It would mean more responsibility, I added, waiting, giving him a chance to engage, to ask, to care, but he just nodded. You already work a lot, he said, like that was the only part that mattered. Like the rest of it was just noise. I sat down across from him, watching the way the light from his screen reflected in his eyes, and for a moment I almost said something else. Something honest. Something that might have shifted the conversation, but instead I picked up my fork and let it go. A few days later, I started noticing Sophia's name more often. Not directly, not openly, but in passing. The new consultant has some interesting ideas, my manager mentioned during a team update, and I felt that same quiet tightening in my chest. What kind of ideas? I asked, keeping my tone neutral, and he hesitated for just a second before answering. Fresh perspective on operations. Fresh, that word again. Light, vague, impossible to measure. I nodded slowly. Does she have experience with our system? I asked, and he shifted slightly. Not directly, but she is learning. Learning. I repeated the word in my mind, feeling its weight, its implications. Later that week, I saw her for the first time in the office, standing near the glass conference room with a tablet in her hand, talking to someone from leadership. She looked confident, comfortable, like she already belonged there, and when she turned slightly, I recognized her immediately. The same woman from my kitchen, the same easy smile, the same familiarity that did not belong in my life. She glanced in my direction for a brief moment, just long enough for our eyes to meet, and there was a flicker of recognition there, quickly masked, quickly dismissed, like it did not matter, like I did not matter. I kept walking, my steps steady, my expression unchanged, but inside something shifted again, deeper this time, more certain, because now it was no longer just a suspicion or a feeling. It was a pattern forming in real time. Work, home, conversations left unfinished, names appearing where they should not, and as I sat at my desk later that evening, watching lines of code scroll across my screen, I realized something I had not wanted to admit before. Whatever was happening was not random, and it was not small. It was building, quietly, deliberately, and I was standing right in the middle of it, without fully understanding how all the pieces connected yet, but I could feel it, the same way I could feel a system about to fail before the first error appeared. Something was about to break, and this time it was not just going to be the code. I started to notice the shift, not in one big moment, but in small things that did not quite fit together, like pieces from different puzzles being forced into the same space. It began with emails that I was suddenly not included on, threads that used to come directly to me now rerouted through others, and when I asked about it, the answers were always smooth, always reasonable. We are just trying a more collaborative approach, my manager said one afternoon, leaning casually against my desk, and I nodded, even though I knew that was not how our system worked. Collaboration sounded good in theory, but in reality, it only slowed things down unless someone was quietly holding it all together behind the scenes, which had always been me. You should take a step back, he added, like it was a favor, like it was something I should be grateful for. I gave a small smile. If that is what you need, I said, because pushing back would have made it uncomfortable, and I had spent my whole life avoiding that. A few days later, I walked into a meeting already in progress, voices low, focused, and when I opened the door, the conversation stopped just long enough for me to feel it, that subtle shift in energy when a room recalibrates around someone who is no longer central to the discussion. Oh, Elena, we were just reviewing some updates, Sophia said, sitting at the head of the table like she had always been there, her tone warm but controlled, like she was playing a role she had practiced. I thought this was scheduled for later, I replied, glancing at the clock on the wall. 10:15 a.m., 10 minutes before the time on my calendar. We started early, my boss said without meeting my eyes, and I took a seat near the end of the table, not where I used to sit, not where decisions were made. Sophia has been working on some improvements to the system, he continued, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger yet, just recognition, because I knew exactly what that meant. I watched as she tapped her tablet, bringing up slides that looked familiar in a way that made my stomach drop. Diagrams, workflows, structures that mirrored the architecture I had built over years, simplified, repackaged, presented as something new. We are streamlining processes, she explained, pointing at a chart that removed layers she clearly did not understand. Reducing dependencies. Dependencies, I repeated the word silently, feeling its weight, because the system was built on dependencies, carefully balanced connections that allowed everything to function smoothly. Remove the wrong one and the whole thing would collapse. Have you tested this against live data? I asked, keeping my voice calm, measured, and she paused just long enough for it to register. We have run preliminary simulations, she replied, and I nodded slowly. Simulations are not the same as production, I said, and my boss cleared his throat. Elena, we appreciate your input, but we need to be open to new perspectives. New perspectives, that phrase again. Light, dismissive, designed to sound progressive while ignoring reality. I leaned back slightly, folding my hands in my lap. Of course, I said, because arguing in that room would not change anything. It would only confirm whatever narrative they had already built about me, that I was resistant, outdated, unwilling to adapt. The meeting continued without me, decisions being made, timelines set, responsibilities assigned, and I listened quietly, noting every detail, every assumption, every gap, because that was what I had always done. I understood systems, not just code, but people, patterns, the way small shifts led to larger consequences. And what I was seeing was not innovation, it was erosion, slow, deliberate, and somehow everyone was buying into it. Later that afternoon, I was called into my boss's office, the door closing softly behind me. We need to talk about your role, he said, sitting behind his desk with his hands folded, the same calm posture from the meeting. I thought we already did, I replied, taking a seat across from him, and he gave a tight smile. Things are evolving faster than we expected, he said, choosing his words carefully. Sophia is bringing a different energy to the team, and we want to support that. I held his gaze, steady, waiting for him to say it directly, to be honest for once, but he did not. We are thinking of transitioning you into a more supportive position, he continued, and there it was, wrapped in soft language, designed to minimize the impact. Supportive, I repeated, letting the words sit between us. You mean stepping back from decision-making? I said, and he shifted slightly. Temporarily, he added. Like that made it better. Like that made it fair. I nodded once, slowly, because I understood now. This was not about performance. It was not about the system. It was about perception, about control, about rewriting the story in a way that made me smaller, easier to replace. Is this about my work? I asked, giving him one last chance to ground this in reality, and he hesitated just for a second before answering. It is about alignment. Alignment. Another word that sounded meaningful but said nothing. I stood up then, smoothing my blazer, the same way I had in that conference room. I understand, I said, my voice calm, controlled, and for a moment, he looked relieved, like he expected resistance and did not get it, like he thought this would be easy. I walked out of his office and back to my desk, the hum of the office around me feeling distant, like I was observing it from somewhere else. And as I sat down, looking at the system I had built, the one they were now trying to reshape without understanding, I realized something with a clarity that settled deep in my chest. They were not just underestimating me. They were dismantling something they did not even realize, depended entirely on me. And as I watched a new update notification appear on my screen, one I had not approved, one that was being pushed live without my oversight, I felt that stillness again. That quiet moment before everything breaks, and this time there was no doubt, because the first error alert appeared less than 30 seconds later. The first alert appeared as a small red notification in the corner of my screen, easy to miss if you did not know what it meant. But I did. I always did. That should not be happening, I said quietly to myself as I clicked into the system logs. lines of code scrolling faster than usual, errors stacking on top of each other in a pattern I recognized immediately. Not random, not isolated. This was structural. Something had been changed at a level that affected everything downstream, and I knew exactly where to look. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for just a second before I stopped, not because I did not know how to fix it, but because I realized something else. I was no longer supposed to be the one fixing anything. "Elena, are you seeing this?" A voice called from across the office, panic already creeping in. I turned slightly in my chair and nodded. "I see it," I replied, calm, controlled, and then I looked back at my screen without moving to resolve it. Across the room, Sophia stood near the main monitor, her tablet in hand, tapping quickly, her expression tight in a way I had not seen before. "It is just a temporary glitch," she said, her voice louder than necessary, meant to reassure, meant to assert control. But the system did not respond to confidence, it responded to understanding, and that was something she did not have yet. "Why are the client dashboards blank?" someone asked, and another voice followed. "Orders are not processing." The room shifted from quiet discomfort to active concern in less than a minute. Chairs moving, keyboards clattering, phones being picked up and set down again. "Elena, can you take a look?" my manager asked, stepping closer to my desk, his tone careful, like he was testing the ground between us. I turned my chair slightly to face him, meeting his eyes for the first time that day. "I thought you wanted me in a more supportive role," I said. My voice even, not sharp, just factual. And he hesitated, just for a second. "This is different," he replied, and I nodded slowly. "Is it?" I asked, and then I turned back to my screen. Without saying anything else, the errors continued to build, one triggering another, dependencies failing in sequence, exactly the way I had predicted during that meeting, exactly the way I had warned without being heard. Within 10 minutes, the first external call came in. I could hear it from where I was sitting, the receptionist's voice tight as she transferred it. "It is a client," she mouthed to someone, and then another call followed, and another. The system was not just slowing down now, it was breaking, and everyone could see it. "We need to fix this now," my boss said sharply, stepping out of his office, his earlier calm gone, replaced by urgency. He looked directly at Sophia. "What is happening?" And she straightened slightly, forcing composure. "I am looking into it," she said, tapping faster on her tablet, but her movements were not precise, not targeted. They were searching, guessing, and that was the difference. She did not know where the system actually lived, she only knew how it was presented. "Elena," my manager said again, quieter this time, closer. "We need your help." I could feel the weight of the room shifting toward me, not fully, not openly, but enough to recognize the pattern changing. I looked at my screen, at the lines of code that had been part of my daily life for years, and then I reached over and locked my computer, the screen going dark with a soft click. "I am not on this project anymore," I said, standing up slowly, and the silence that followed felt different from the one in the conference room, heavier, more uncertain. "Elena, this is not the time," my boss said, his voice controlled but strained. "The system is failing." I met his gaze, steady. "Then you should let the person in charge fix it," I replied. And for a moment no one spoke, because the truth was sitting right there in the middle of the room, and no one wanted to say it out loud. I picked up my phone from the desk, feeling it vibrate lightly in my hand, the first of many notifications coming through, emails, alerts, messages from clients who suddenly could not access what they depended on. I did not open them yet. I just held the phone, feeling the steady rhythm of incoming requests, each one a reminder of how much of this system ran through me, even now, especially now. "You cannot just walk away," my manager said, his voice low, almost pleading. And I looked at him for a second. He really looked. "I already did," I said quietly, and then I walked out of the office the same way I had walked out of that meeting, calm, measured, controlled. The hallway felt different this time, not empty, but distant. Like I was already stepping outside of something that was still trying to hold me in place. By the time I reached the elevator, my phone was ringing, a direct call from my boss. I watched his name appear on the screen, then disappear, then appear again as he called back immediately. I did not answer. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped inside and leaned lightly against the wall, watching the numbers change as I went down. The phone kept ringing, then stopped, then started again. This time my manager, then an unknown number, then Sophia, her name appearing in clean white letters across the screen like we had any reason to speak. I let it ring every time. By the time I reached the parking lot, the notifications had turned into a constant stream. Emails stacking, subject lines urgent, critical, system down, access lost. I sat in my car and finally opened one. A message from a client I had worked with for years. "Elena, we cannot access the platform. What is happening?" And I stared at the words for a moment before locking my phone again, because answering it would mean stepping back into something that had already decided I did not belong. A few seconds later, another message came through. This one from my husband. "We need to talk." Simple, direct, like nothing had changed, like everything had not just collapsed in a single morning. I looked at his name on the screen and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not sadness, just distance. A quiet, steady distance that I had not allowed myself before. The phone rang again, his name flashing once more, and I let it ring until it stopped, until the car was filled with silence again. And for the first time in a long time, there was no one asking me to fix anything, no one expecting me to step in, no one even pretending to understand what they had just lost. And I sat there in that silence, feeling the weight of it, realizing that this was what it meant to finally stop holding everything together. Not relief, not yet, just a quiet, complete isolation that no one else could see. I did not drive home right away. I sat in that parking lot until the sun started to shift, and the light inside the car changed from sharp to soft, my phone resting face down in the cup holder, still vibrating every few seconds like a heartbeat I was trying not to listen to. And for the first time in years, there was nothing I needed to respond to, nothing I had to fix. And it felt less like freedom and more like something had been taken out of me, something I had built my entire rhythm around. I finally picked up the phone and looked at the screen. 32 missed calls, 11 voicemails, more emails than I could count without opening them, and one message from my husband that stood out because it was the only one that did not mention the system or the company. It just said, "Please come home." Simple, direct, like everything else could wait. I stared at those words for a long moment before I started the engine and drove. The road home felt longer than usual, traffic lights taking just a little too long to change, every stop giving me more time to think about what I was about to walk into. When I opened the front door, the house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels intentional, like someone is waiting. "Elena?" His voice came from the living room, cautious, uncertain, and I stepped inside, setting my keys down in the same place I always did, the small habits that do not change even when everything else does. He was standing near the window, his posture different, not relaxed, not distracted, just still. "You did not answer your phone," he said, and I nodded once. "I saw," I replied, my voice calm, controlled, and he took a small step closer. "We need to talk," he repeated, the same words from the message, and I looked at him, really looked, at the way his shoulders were slightly tense, the way his eyes searched my face for something, reaction, anger, anything. "About what?" I asked. Not because I did not know, but because I wanted to hear what he would choose to say first. He hesitated, just for a second. "About work," he said, and something inside me settled further. Not surprise, not disappointment, just confirmation. "Work," I repeated, letting the words sit there between us, and he nodded quickly. "There is a situation, the system is down. Sophia is trying to fix it, but it is more complicated than she expected. More complicated than she expected." I almost smiled at that, but I did not. "And you think I can help?" I said, and he stepped closer. "I know you can," he replied, his voice softening, reaching for something familiar, something that used to work. "You always do, always." I repeated that word in my mind, feeling its weight, its history. "Elena, this is serious. Clients are already calling. The company is losing money every minute. This is down," he continued. And I listened, really listened, not to the urgency in his voice, but to what was missing. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, no recognition of what had happened that morning. Just the problem, just the expectation that I would step in and solve it, because that was what I had always done. "And Sophia?" I asked, my tone even, and he looked away for just a moment before answering. "She is doing her best," he said, and I nodded slowly. "I am sure she is," I replied, and then I walked past him into the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had first seen her, where everything had started to unravel in a way I had not fully understood at the time. I poured a glass of water and leaned lightly against the counter, feeling the cool surface under my hands, grounding, steady. "You knew," I said quietly, not looking at him, and there was a pause behind me, a shift in the air. "Knew what?" he asked, but his voice had changed, just slightly, enough to tell me everything. I turned then, meeting his eyes. "About her," I said, and he exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "It is not what you think," he started, the most predictable sentence in the world, and I shook my head once, not sharply, just enough. "Then tell me what it is," I said, giving him the space to be honest, really honest, and he looked at me, searching, calculating, choosing, and then he said, "It just happened." Like that explained anything, like that erased the weeks, the months, the quiet distance that had been growing between us. "It just happened," I repeated, feeling the words land flat, empty. "And bringing her into my work, into my role, that also just happened?" I asked, and he stepped closer again. "I did not plan it like this," he said quickly. "She got the opportunity on her own." And I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh. "Of course she did," I said, because I could see now how the pieces fit together, how the lines between personal and professional had blurred in ways that benefited everyone except me. "Elena, please," he said, his voice dropping, softer now, more familiar. "I know you are upset, but we can figure this out. Just help with the system first, then we will talk about everything else." And there it was, the order of importance laid out clearly. Fix the problem, then deal with the feelings, if there was anything left to deal with at all. I looked at him for a long moment, at the man I had built a life around, the one who had slowly become a stranger without me noticing, and I realized something with a clarity that did not hurt the way I expected it to. I was not just losing a job, I was not just dealing with a betrayal. I was standing in the middle of a life that had been built on me holding everything together while everyone else moved freely around it, and now that I had stepped back, even for a moment, everything was showing its cracks. "I cannot do that anymore," I said quietly, and he froze slightly, like he had not expected that answer. "What do you mean?" he asked, and I set the glass down carefully on the counter, the small sound it made echoing in the quiet space between us. "I mean, I am tired," I said, not loudly, not dramatically, just truthfully. "Tired of fixing things that should not be broken in the first place. Tired of being the one who holds everything together while no one even sees it." He stared at me, trying to understand, trying to find the version of me that would say something else, something easier. But that version was not there anymore. "So you are just going to let everything fall apart?" he asked, and I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied. "I am just not going to be the one holding it up anymore." The silence that followed was different from the others. Not heavy, not tense, just empty, like something had already ended, and we were both standing there realizing it at the same time. My phone buzzed again on the counter, another call, another message, but I did not reach for it. I did not need to, because for the first time I was not being pulled in every direction. I was just standing still, and even though it felt like I had lost something I could not quite name, there was also something else there, something small, something quiet, like the beginning of space where something new might exist. I did not know what that would look like yet. I only knew that I could not go back to what I had been, and that was the first step I had not taken before. I did not wake up the next morning with a plan or a sense of direction. I woke up because the light came through the window and I had nowhere else to hide from it. The house felt different in the quiet, not tense like the night before, just empty. Like something had already been cleared out without anyone saying it out loud. My husband had left early, or maybe he had not come back at all. I did not check. I did not look for signs. I walked into the kitchen, poured coffee into the same mug I had used for years, and sat at the table without turning on the television or reaching for my phone. It buzzed once on the counter, and I let it sit there, face down, like it belonged to a different version of me. The one who answered immediately, the one who kept everything moving. After a while I stood up, not because I felt ready, but because staying still felt heavier than moving. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table, the same place I had answered late-night alerts and fixed broken processes. But this time there was no system to log into, no dashboard waiting for me. Just a blank screen and a quiet question I had not asked myself in years. What do I actually want to build if it is not for them? I sat there for a long moment before typing a single line, not code, just a simple outline of what I knew how to do: systems, integrations, problem solving. And then I stopped, because for the first time I realized those skills were not tied to a company, they were mine. I closed the laptop gently and picked up my phone, scrolling through contacts I had not reached out to in a long time. Names of clients who had worked with me directly, people who had trusted me even when the company did not fully understand what I was doing. I hesitated for a second before tapping on one. "Hi, this is Elena," I said when the call connected, my voice steady even though it felt unfamiliar to be the one initiating. "I wanted to check in and see how things are going on your end." There was a pause and then a small laugh on the other side. "Elena, I was actually just about to call you. Everything is down. No one can access anything. Do you know what is happening over there?" I let the question sit for a moment, choosing my words carefully. "I am not there anymore," I replied, and there was another pause, longer this time. "You are not?" he asked, surprised, and I shook my head even though he could not see me. "No," I said, simple, clear, and he exhaled slowly. "That explains a lot," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Listen, if you are not tied to them anymore, we could really use your help on our side, even just temporarily." The offer landed quietly, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just there. A possibility that did not come with expectations. I did not choose. "Let me think about it," I said, and he nodded. "Of course, just let me know." After the call ended, I sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle again, but this time it felt different, less empty, more open. I spent the rest of the morning going through old files, personal backups I had kept over the years, notes, structures, frameworks I had built and refined, things that had never been fully documented because they lived in my head. I started organizing them, not for anyone else, just to see them clearly for myself. By the afternoon, I had a basic structure laid out, something that could stand on its own if I let it. My phone buzzed again, this time a message from my manager. "We need to talk. This is getting worse." I read it once and then set the phone aside without responding. A few minutes later, another message came through, this time from my husband. "They are asking for you by name." I stared at the screen for a second before typing a short reply. "I am not available." And then I put the phone down again. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street, people moving through their day without knowing anything about mine. And for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I was behind, like I was catching up. I felt still, grounded, in a way that was new. Later that evening, I met with one of the clients who had reached out earlier. We sat at a small table in a quiet cafe, laptops open, papers spread out between us. "So you built all of this?" he asked, scrolling through the structure I had shown him, and I nodded. "Over time," I said, and he leaned back slightly, studying me. "Why were you not running the whole thing?" he asked, half joking but not really. And I smiled faintly. "That is a longer story," I replied, and he nodded. "Well, whatever you decide to do next, I want in," he said. Simple, direct, and I felt something shift again. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a small, steady recognition that maybe this was not the end of something. Maybe it was the beginning of something that had been waiting for me to stop holding everything else together. As I walked back to my car that night, the air felt different, lighter somehow, and I realized I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I could build without asking for permission, without shrinking it to fit someone else's idea of what I should be. And for the first time since that meeting, since that morning, I could see something ahead of me that did not depend on them at all, something that was entirely mine, and I had a feeling that when it was fully built, when it was finally seen for what it was going to change more than just my life. 3 weeks later, I was standing in a glass office, 20 floors above the city, with my name printed on a badge that actually belonged to me this time, not a role someone handed over or took away, just my name, Elena Rivera, with a small line underneath that read, Systems Consultant and Founder, the letters clean and simple. And I remember looking at it for a second longer than necessary before clipping it to my blazer, not because it was impressive, but because it was real. "You ready?" Mark asked from the doorway, one of the first clients who had reached out after everything collapsed, now standing there with a folder in his hand and a half smile that felt more like respect than curiosity. I nodded once, picking up my laptop. "Let us do this," I said, and we walked into a conference room where 6 people were already waiting, their screens filled with data they did not fully trust anymore, their systems still unstable after trying to patch what they did not understand. "We appreciate you coming in," one of them said as I set my laptop down and connected it to the display. "We have been struggling to get things back online." I glanced at the screen, scanning quickly, recognizing patterns immediately. "You are fixing symptoms," I said, not harsh, just clear, and a few of them exchanged looks. "What do you mean?" another asked, leaning forward slightly, and I pointed to a section of the architecture diagram. "The issue is not here, it is here," I said, tapping lightly. "Everything depends on this layer, and right now it is unstable." They went quiet for a second, the kind of quiet that meant they were listening, not avoiding, and I started walking them through it, step by step, not simplifying, not shrinking it, just explaining it the way it actually worked. "So if we rebuild this properly, everything else stabilizes?" Mark asked, and I nodded. "Exactly," I replied, "but it has to be done correctly the first time." I could feel the shift in the room, subtle but real, the way people sat a little straighter, the way they stopped interrupting and started taking notes, not because I demanded it, but because I knew what I was talking about and I was not pretending otherwise. 2 hours later, the first part of the system was back online. Not fully, not perfectly, but stable enough for them to breathe again. "That was fast," someone said quietly, almost to themselves, and I closed my laptop. "It is not fast," I replied. "It is just familiar." After the meeting, Mark walked me back to the elevator, his expression thoughtful. "You know, they tried to bring in 2 other consultants before you," he said, pressing the button, and I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Did it help?" I asked, and he let out a short laugh. "Not even close," he replied, then looked at me more seriously. "What you built before, that system, it was not just good, it was foundational." They did not realize that until it was gone. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "That happens," I said simply, because I had already accepted that part. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside, watching as he gave a small nod before the doors closed again. The ride down was quiet, my reflection faint in the mirrored wall. Blazer fitted, posture straight, not forced, just natural now. When I stepped out into the lobby, my phone buzzed in my hand, a message from another client confirming a contract we had discussed earlier that week. Then another email notification, then another, not urgent, not panicked, just steady, consistent, like something that was building instead of breaking. I walked outside into the afternoon light, the city moving around me in its usual rhythm, and for a moment I just stood there, feeling it. Not the noise, not the pressure, just the space I had stepped into. Later that evening, I returned to the small office I had started using, a simple space with a desk, a whiteboard, and a window that looked out over a row of buildings that all looked the same at sunset. I set my bag down and clipped the badge onto the edge of the board, not as decoration, just as a reminder. I turned on my laptop and opened the framework I had been building, expanding it, refining it, not for one company, not for one system, but as something that could stand on its own, something that did not depend on being hidden behind someone else's structure. My phone buzzed again, this time a call. I glanced at the screen and saw my former manager's name. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "Hello," I said, my tone neutral, and there was a pause on the other end, like he was not sure how to start. "Elena, we need to talk," he said finally. The same words from before, but they sounded different now, less certain, more careful. I leaned back slightly in my chair, looking at the screen in front of me. "About what?" I asked, and he exhaled slowly. "About the system, about everything," he replied, and I nodded even though he could not see me. Because this was the moment where the timelines were starting to meet again, the past and the present no longer separate, just different sides of the same story. "I am listening," I said, calm, controlled, and as he began to speak, I realized we had reached the point where everything that had happened was about to circle back, not to repeat itself, but to be seen clearly for the first time. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning, but I arrived at 9:30. Not because I was early, but because I needed the extra time to sit in the space before anyone else filled it with their urgency. The building looked the same from the outside, glass and steel, reflecting a sky that did not care about anything happening inside. But the moment I stepped through the doors, I could feel the difference. The energy had shifted, quieter, tighter, like something fragile was being held together just long enough to pretend it was not already broken. "Good morning," the receptionist said, her voice softer than I remembered, and she gave me a small nod that felt more like acknowledgement than routine politeness. "They are expecting you," she added, and I nodded once. "I know," I replied, my tone calm, steady, as I walked past the same hallway I had walked through so many times before, the same floors, the same lights, but now I was not part of it. I was walking through it, observing, noting the small details, the way people avoided eye contact just a little too quickly, the way conversations paused when I passed, not out of disrespect, but uncertainty. They did not know where I fit anymore, and neither did the system they were trying to fix. When I reached the conference room, the door was already closed, voices low inside. I could hear my boss speaking, measured but strained. "We cannot keep losing clients like this," he said, and another voice followed, one I recognized immediately, Sophia. "I am doing everything I can," she replied, her tone controlled but thinner than before, like confidence stretched too far. I stood there for a second before knocking lightly and opening the door. The room went quiet instantly, the kind of silence that arrives all at once, not gradually, like a switch being flipped. All eyes turned toward me, and for a moment no one spoke, not because they did not know what to say, but because they were recalibrating, adjusting to the version of me standing in front of them now, not the one they had dismissed, not the one they thought they understood, just me, Elena. My boss said finally, standing up slightly from his chair, his posture shifting into something more formal, more careful. "Thank you for coming." I nodded once and stepped inside, setting my laptop on the table but not opening it yet, not immediately giving them what they wanted. "You said it was urgent," I replied, and he exhaled slowly. "It is," he said, gesturing toward the screens around the room. Dashboards filled with incomplete data, error messages blinking in quiet rhythm. "We have not been able to stabilize the system since you left." Since I left. I noted the phrasing but did not correct it. I moved closer to the display, scanning quickly, recognizing the patterns I had already expected to see. The same dependencies failing, the same misalignment between layers. Nothing random, nothing surprising, just inevitable. "What have you tried?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, and Sophia stepped forward slightly, holding her tablet like it anchored her. "We implemented a revised structure to reduce complexity," she said, repeating the language from before. But now it sounded different, less confident, more defensive. I nodded slowly. "And did you map the impact across all dependent systems before pushing it live?" I asked, and she hesitated just for a second. "We ran simulations," she replied, and I held her gaze for a moment, not challenging, just steady. "Simulations are not the same," I said quietly, and the room remained still, the weight of that truth settling in without needing to be emphasized. My manager shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly. "Elena, we need a solution," he said, his voice lower now, less directive, more asking, and I turned to face him. "You had a system that worked," I replied. "You chose to change it." He looked down briefly, then back up. "We made a mistake," he admitted, and that word, mistake, landed differently than I expected. Not satisfying, not dramatic, just accurate. "We need you to help us fix it," my boss added, stepping closer, his tone careful. "Whatever it takes." I let a small pause settle between us, not for effect, just to let the moment breathe. Because this was not about urgency anymore. It was about understanding, about clarity, about finally seeing what had always been there. "Before we talk about fixing anything," I said, placing my hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding myself in the space, "I need to understand something." My boss nodded quickly. "Of course," he said, and I looked at him, then at Sophia, then at the rest of the room. "When you decided to replace me," I continued, my voice steady, not raised, not emotional, just clear, "what exactly did you think I was doing here for the last 8 years?" The question hung in the air, not loud, but impossible to ignore. No one answered immediately. Because the truth was not simple. It was layered, built over time, hidden in assumptions they had never questioned. Sophia shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of her tablet. My boss opened his mouth, then closed it again, searching for something that would make sense, something that would hold together under scrutiny. And in that silence, just before anyone spoke, I realized this was the moment everything was about to be revealed. Not just to them, but out loud, in a way that could not be undone once it was said. No one answered right away, and that silence told me more than anything they could have said, because if they truly understood what I had been doing all those years, the answer would have come easily, clearly, without hesitation. But instead they looked at each other, at their screens, at anything but me, trying to piece together something that had never been explained to them in the first place. "You were managing operations," my boss said finally, his voice careful, testing the words as he spoke them, and I nodded slightly, not correcting him yet. "Managing," I repeated, letting the words settle in the room. "Is that what you think this is?" I gestured lightly toward the screens, the system still flickering with instability, and he shifted, just enough to show uncertainty. "You handled workflows, integrations," he added, reaching for more specifics, and I took a small step closer to the display, opening my laptop now, connecting it with a quiet click that echoed just enough to draw everyone's attention. "I did not handle them," I said calmly. "I built them." The room stilled again, but this time it was different. Not avoidance, not discomfort, something sharper, more focused. I brought up the system architecture, not the simplified version they had been using, but the full structure. Layers they had never seen, connections they had never mapped, dependencies that had been invisible until they failed. "This is what you have been working inside," I continued, my voice even controlled. "Every process, every integration, every automated decision, it all runs through this framework." Sophia stepped closer, her eyes scanning the screen, her earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. "This is not what we reviewed," she said, almost to herself, and I glanced at her briefly. "Because you were not given the full system," I replied, not as an accusation, just a fact. My manager leaned forward, studying the diagram. "Why did we not have this documentation?" he asked, and I met his gaze steady. "Because no one asked for it," I said, and that landed harder than anything else I had said so far. Not loud, not dramatic, just true. My boss ran a hand across his face, the tension finally visible. "So when we removed you from the role," he started, and I nodded once, finishing the thought for him. "You removed the only person who understood how all of this actually works," I said. And there it was, clear, unavoidable, the truth they had been circling without fully seeing. Sophia took a small step back, her grip on the tablet loosening slightly. "I was told the system was scalable, adaptable," she said, her voice quieter now, and I nodded. "It is," I replied, "when it is handled correctly." I let a brief pause settle before continuing. "What you changed here," I pointed to a section of the structure. "This removed a critical dependency layer. Everything downstream relies on it. Without it, the system does not fail immediately. It degrades, slowly, until it reaches a point where nothing functions properly." My boss exhaled sharply, looking at the screens again as if seeing them differently now. "That is exactly what is happening," he said, almost under his breath, and I nodded. "Yes," I replied, "it is predictable." The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the kind of silence that avoided me. It was the kind that listened, absorbed, recalculated. "Why did you not tell us it was this complex?" my manager asked, and I looked at him for a moment, considering the question. "I tried," I said simply, "but it was easier to call it maintenance, easier to assume it was something anyone could step into." He looked down at the table, his expression shifting into something closer to understanding. "We thought," he started, then stopped, and I did not fill in the rest for him, because they already knew what they had thought, that I was replaceable, that my work was routine, that the system would continue without me, because they had never been asked to see how it actually worked. My boss straightened slightly, his tone more direct now. "Can you fix it?" he asked, and I held his gaze, not avoiding, not softening. "Yes," I said, and relief flickered across his face before I added, "but not the way you expect." He paused, the relief fading into uncertainty. "What do you mean?" he asked, and I closed the laptop gently, the click quiet but final. I can rebuild the structure, stabilize the system, but it will not be the same, I said, my voice calm, controlled, because I am not the same. That landed differently, more personal, more immediate. Sophia looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing something she had not considered before. You are saying this is not just technical, she said slowly, and I nodded. It never was, I replied, and my boss took a small step forward. Elena, whatever you need, resources, authority, we will make it happen, he said, his tone firm now, decisive, like he was trying to regain control of a situation that had already shifted beyond his reach. I held his gaze for a moment, then shook my head slightly. That is not how this works, I said, and he frowned just slightly. Then how does it work? He asked, and I let the silence stretch for a second before answering. You do not get to remove someone, replace them, ignore what they built, and then expect everything to return to normal when it breaks. I said, not sharply, not loudly, just clearly, and the weight of that truth settled into the room in a way that could not be undone. My manager leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting into something closer to realization. We did not just lose a system, he said quietly, and I nodded once. No, I replied, you lost the person who made it work. And the shock that followed was not loud, not dramatic, it was quiet, internal, the kind that changes how people see everything that came before, because for the first time they understood that this was not a simple mistake. It was a complete misjudgment of who I had been all along. No one spoke for a few seconds after that, not because they did not have anything to say, but because the structure of what they believed had already shifted and they were trying to adjust to it in real time. My boss was the first to move, straightening his posture like he was stepping into a role he should have taken earlier. We need to correct this, he said, his voice steady but no longer authoritative in the same way. More careful now, more aware. I watched him for a moment before responding. Correction starts with understanding, I said calmly, and he nodded, slower this time, as if he was choosing to listen instead of direct. My manager leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table. Elena, we underestimated your role, that is clear now, he said, his tone measured, not defensive, and I held his gaze. You did not just underestimate my role, I replied, you dismissed it. The words were not sharp, but they landed with weight. He exhaled quietly, nodding once, accepting that without trying to argue it, Sophia had not spoken for a while, but now she stepped forward slightly, placing her tablet down on the table like she was letting go of something she could no longer hold on to. I was not given the full picture, she said, her voice softer than before, less certain, and I looked at her, really looked this time, not as a rival, not as a replacement, just as someone who had been placed into a situation she did not fully understand. You accepted a position you did not question, I replied, and she swallowed lightly, nodding once. I thought I could learn it, she said, and I gave a small nod in return. Learning is not the issue, I said. Assuming control without understanding is. She looked down briefly, the weight of that settling in. And I did not press further, because this was not about tearing her down, it was about clarity. My boss stepped closer again. Elena, we need to move forward, and we want you leading this, he said, his tone direct, offering authority now instead of taking it. I let a small pause settle before answering, not for effect, just to make sure the words I chose were exactly what I meant. I am not coming back, I said calmly, clearly. And the reaction was immediate, not loud, but visible. My manager blinked, caught off guard. Not even temporarily? He asked, and I shook my head slightly. I can consult, I said. I can guide you through rebuilding what was broken, but I will not step back into a role where my work is invisible until it fails. My boss nodded slowly, absorbing that is fair, he said, and there was something in his tone that had not been there before. Not agreement, but acceptance, the kind that comes when you realize the terms are no longer yours to set. My manager leaned back, running a hand through his hair. We should have handled this differently, he said quietly, and I met his gaze. Yes, I replied, not adding anything else, because the specifics were already understood. Sophia picked up her tablet again, but this time she did not hold it the same way, not like a shield, more like a tool she had to relearn how to use. If you are consulting, she said carefully, I would like to understand the system properly. I nodded once. Then you will need to start from the foundation, I replied, and she gave a small, almost relieved nod. Like the clarity mattered more than the position now, my boss gestured toward the screen again. What is the first step? He asked, and I turned slightly, looking at the architecture I had displayed earlier. We rebuild the dependency layer, I said, correctly this time. He nodded. And you will guide that? He asked, and I paused for just a second before answering. I will define it, I said. How you implement it will determine whether it holds. The distinction was small but important, and he seemed to understand that, nodding once more, the room shifted again, not back to what it had been, but into something new, something more deliberate, more aware. But even as they started asking questions, even as they began to adjust their approach, I felt the distance between me and that space remain, not cold, not hostile, just separate. Because I was no longer part of the structure they were trying to fix, I was standing outside of it, defining the terms on my own. After the meeting ended, people lingered for a moment, not rushing out the way they usually did, conversations quieter, more thoughtful. My manager approached me as others began to leave. Elena, he said, hesitating slightly, for what it is worth, I am sorry. I looked at him, considering the words, not dismissing them, but not letting them carry more weight than they should. I know, I replied, and that was enough, he nodded. Stepping back, accepting that there was nothing more to add, Sophia paused near the door, glancing back once. Thank you, she said, simple, direct, and I gave a small nod in return. Not because everything was resolved, but because something had shifted, something real. When I finally stepped out of the room and into the hallway again, it felt different from when I had walked in. Not tense, not uncertain, just quieter, more grounded, but as I walked toward the exit, I realized something else. This was not closure, not fully. Because even though the truth had been spoken and the roles had been redefined, there were still parts of this that remained unresolved, not in the system, not in the company, but in the life I had left behind, and I knew that sooner or later, that part would come back to meet me again. The days after that meeting did not feel like a victory, and they did not feel like an ending either. They felt quiet in a way I had not experienced before, like the noise that had always surrounded me had finally settled into something I could hear through. I did not go back to that office as an employee. I walked into it only when I chose to, on my terms, guiding the rebuild, defining the structure, and then stepping away again, not out of anger, but out of clarity, because I no longer needed to stay where I had once felt invisible just to prove that I mattered. The system stabilized over the next few weeks, not quickly, not perfectly, but correctly this time, layer by layer, with intention instead of assumption, and every time I left that building, I did not carry it with me the way I used to. I left it behind where it belonged. One evening, after another long day of consulting, I returned to the apartment that no longer felt like a shared space. My husband was sitting at the kitchen table, the same place where everything had started to unravel. He looked up when I walked in, his expression softer now, uncertain, like he was no longer sure how to stand in front of me. You look different, he said quietly, and I set my bag down, taking a moment before answering. I feel different, I replied, and he nodded like he understood something he had not before. I made a mistake, he said, the words simple, not dramatic, and I looked at him, really looked. Not searching for something to hold on to, not waiting for something to fix, just seeing him as he was. Yes, I said calmly, not unkindly. And there was a pause that followed, not heavy, just honest. Is there a way back? He asked. And I took a breath, not because the answer was difficult, but because it was clear. There is a way forward, I said, but it is not the same path. He lowered his gaze slightly, absorbing that, and I could see it in the way his shoulders shifted. The understanding settling in, not all at once, but enough. We did not argue. We did not revisit every detail, because some things do not need to be broken down to be understood. Sometimes they just need to be acknowledged, and then left where they belong. Over time, the distance between us became something quieter, not forced, not hostile, just real. We moved through the process of separating our lives, the same way I had rebuilt the system, step by step, with clarity, with intention, not trying to rush through what needed to be understood. I found a new place not far from the city, a small apartment with large windows and a desk that faced the light in the morning. And the first thing I placed there was not my laptop, not my files, but the small badge I had clipped to my blazer weeks earlier. Elena Rivera, systems consultant and founder. I set it on the edge of the desk, not as a symbol of success, but as a reminder of something simpler, something more important, that my name was enough, that it did not need to be attached to someone else's structure to have value. My work continued to grow, not in sudden leaps, but in steady, consistent steps. Clients who had once seen me as part of a company began to see me as the one who understood what they needed. And I built something new, not just a system, but a way of working that did not require me to shrink or stay silent to keep things running. There were still quiet moments, still days where I felt the weight of everything that had changed, but they did not pull me back. They reminded me of where I had been and how far I had moved from it. If there is one thing I learned through all of this, it is that we do not lose ourselves all at once. We let go of small pieces over time, until one day we realize we are holding everything together except who we are. And the moment we stop doing that, everything else may feel like it is falling apart. But in reality, it is just making space for something that finally belongs to us. If you are listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you have ever been in a place where your value was measured by how quietly you held things together for everyone else, I want you to know that your worth is not defined by how much you can endure. It is defined by how clearly you can see yourself and choose not to disappear. Trust that quiet voice inside you, the one that notices when something feels off, the one that tells you when you are being asked to give more than you should. That voice is not weakness, it is guidance. And sometimes it is the only thing that will lead you back to yourself. Protect what you build, not just your work, but your time, your energy, your peace, because those are the things that cannot be replaced once they are gone. And do not be afraid to step away from what no longer sees you clearly, even if it once felt like everything, because walking away is not losing. It is choosing yourself in a way you may not have done before. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for understanding, for being part of a moment that once felt isolating but now feels shared. My name is Elena Rivera. I am 34 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let anyone define your value by what they are willing to see, because your true worth exists whether they recognize it or not. If this story stayed with you in some way, you can share your thoughts, your own experiences, or simply where you are listening from, because sometimes just knowing someone else understands is enough to make things feel lighter. And if you want to keep walking through stories like this, ones that explore what it means to lose yourself and find your way back, there are more waiting for you, each one carrying a different truth, a different moment, a different way of seeing what we often overlook. Take your time, follow what resonates, and maybe the next story will meet you exactly where you are right now.